action research and the CFR. So I'll cover first just maybe how action research is, it funds the fundamentals of the CEFR really, and that's where it came from, and then go into a little bit about action research, and then talk about a good few projects that are action research informed, and then I'll be introducing a model for that links action research and the Common European Framework. I will be stopping 1 or 2 or 3 times for those people online or those people who are watching it after the event, just for you, for in your own context, to maybe think the questions that I'm posing. You can maybe just pause it, and then you can just work along this. So that's kind of where I'm going. So just to give you an introduction, I'm not going to give you a history of the Common European Framework, because if we look at the first document on the left-hand side there, wage stage 1990, the genesis of that, I think the first publication was in 1975, 2 years before I was born. So I cannot give you a great history lesson, but just to see that the evolution of the Common European Framework was basically how can we have an aligned view of language acquisition, basically. And it eventually became the first published document in 2001, and then 2020, is it? So we looked at the companion volume. So it's continuously evolving, and I would probably say the question, first of all, that I asked first was, well, how can we get a constructively aligned view of language acquisition and language learning? That is a fundamentally action research question. And if you see the view of how language acquisition is viewed, you can see that it has evolved over time. And this is the view in the 2020, see the companion volume. So it has changed since we have probably, and it's mediation being at the center. And in terms of how that works with interaction, and how probably right now the biggest challenge, I would say, in terms of the implementation of the CEFR is how do people work with the mediation scales? And I'll then present a little bit about that. So the CEFR it's iterative, and the CEFR work on it most definitely is it's developing all the time. If you look at the recent publication here by several organizations of the Aligning Language Education with the CEFR, the handbook, probably the implicit invitation, and it's more explicit in a publication, recent publication by Fergus, Little and O'Sullivan, where, okay, this is probably, they would view as their first iteration of the handbook of how to align language education with the CEFR. And they would like to see people to share projects that can be included in future iterations. So you can see it's developing and developing. So what I would say is, well, how can that develop? Most definitely is action research, and particularly when you look at in the field of education, and particularly language education, any project that you're going to be doing is action research informed. If you look at this very, very simple graphic here, you will see, okay, let's have a plan. Let's see what we can do. Action, observe, reflect, and that goes on to your reserve plan. And it's just iterations and iterations of how can we improve our provisions to language learners in our programs, basically. So if we are thinking now, well, how do we begin action research? How do we talk about the Common Europe action research in the Common European Framework? I'll propose 2 simple questions, and this will lead on to the model that I'm going to present much later on. But maybe as you're watching, maybe you could be thinking, if you're only just thinking, well, I know I need to make improvements to my language learning initiatives. Well, what are the issues and the research questions that I would like to develop? What is the one or two things that I really need to work on? Then you're thinking about proposing solutions. So to give you specific examples here, for example, in the presentation that's coming up, where you're talking about CEFR linking procedures to inform a teaching program, I believe it's a tutorial English program in Waseda University in Japan. So thinking, well, okay, first of all, what needs to be reformed? How can we make this program more constructively aligned with the CEFR, for example? So that's your starting point. That's your starting specific issue. Then you start thinking, well, how can we reform it? So I'm sure we'll hear about that later on. Maybe another one from within the room, just talking about the HSK, which is the Chinese proficiency test. So thinking, well, how can we align this with the CEFR more? And what areas particularly need to be constructively aligned to make the test more aligned with the CEFR? That's your starting issue. And then you're proposing solutions. For example, okay, you're not going to work on all the 6 levels. You're going to work on the first level, maybe. And then you're going to see, well, okay, what areas in this test do the learners need to be able to do after they take the test? And how is that informed by the CEFR? Then maybe trying to align the test with those matters, okay? Speaking about simple matters, for example. So there are the simple steps that we're thinking about. To give you a bit more detail about how you can potentially identify these issues, I've talked about 2 examples there. Just if you're watching now, past the time online, these are probably tools that you can probably use. So this was a project that I was involved with. I led the project, and we worked with maybe 6 or 8 groups in Japan between 2015 and 2017. And that's the edited volume here. That was the final product. But we just, as the title tells you there, we tried to create critical constructive assessments of CEFR informed language teaching in Japan and some beyond. So in the chapter that bookended this volume, we tried to tie it all together, and we just presented an assessment grid for learning programs. And there's several keys there that will maybe give you a starting key, just give yourself a rating in terms of your language learning program. So this is very much based on the, like if you look at a can-do statement for A1 spoken interaction, for example, you will have maybe 5 to 8 can-do statements. And typically what I would ask learners to do is give them a 1 or 2 or 3 star rating for themselves when they're self-assessing. So can I speak about my interests reasonably well, 2 star well, or 3 star very well? So in the intermediary, goals would be to develop, if you know you are 2 star well, go to 3 star. So if you're looking at your learning program, looking at key 3, is it possible to compare the results of instruction in different classes across and within the institution? Maybe, maybe not. Maybe that's something you need to work on. Key number 6, all can readily apply and see the benefits of CEFR-informed approach for their own teaching and learning. Maybe, maybe not. Maybe you're 1 star and maybe you need to work to get this to 2 star and in the end, 3 star. Very well. So this is probably a starting point for you to think how to actually, what issues, if we're looking at these questions, actually I want to go back, what identifying specific issues, that may be a starting point. Maybe on a lot bigger scale would be this relatively recent ECML project, Quality Assurance Matrix for CEFR use. So if you go into that website, it's quite useful. They will give you 6 areas that you could examine your learning program in terms of sustainability, inclusiveness, coherence, for example. And then you would, I know it's hard to see, but for example, here you have coherence, the green, they seem to be fairly good on that, but maybe sustainability or transparency, they don't seem to be that well. So then they would break those areas down into further areas that you can self-assess upon and maybe identify areas that you need to work on. So what I'm going to do now is to give you several programs, several research projects that have kind of adopted this approach, that have kind of identified areas that they need to work on and how they have integrated a action research perspective. And after I give the example, I'm going to ask you to think about your own context. So if we go back to this assessment grid for learning programs, this was an area, a learning project that is part of this edited volume. There's actually 3 chapters in it, sub-chapters, because they done a quite large project and it took them a long time to do it. But the beginning was assessing their learning programs and seeing what they needed to work on. And so these were probably the main 4 areas that they identified. So this was Bunkyo University, it's in a rural area of Hiroshima Prefecture in Japan. And the problem was basically they needed to attract learners to their institution. And one area that was to have a very good learning program, particularly English learning program. So they just wanted to improve it. That's the central problem. But when they self-assessed, they looked at, are their materials action-oriented, easily applicable by teachers and students? The answer 1, 2, 3 star was probably 1 star. Okay, even if that. So was it easy to compare the results of instruction in different classes? I think they probably 28 classes. No, was the answer. It wasn't even 1 star. Can all readily see the benefits? This is a very diverse answer. Okay, so the director at the time definitely could. Teachers at the time, at the beginning, no. Was autonomous learning specified? Yes, most definitely. But they had a self-access learning center. So the processes were there, but it need to be connected with the curricula itself. So what they basically done, they conducted a curriculum renewal cycle and they looked at teacher training and aligning. So that's to give you an idea of the first steps of identify specific issues, and then you formulate your research questions. So I'm going to ask you to stop now if you're watching online and just to go through some of these points and other areas. Look at this grid and maybe go online, Google the quality assurance matrix the CEFR use, self-assess your learning program based on that, and identify issues that you need to work on. Okay, then the next step is to propose solutions. So what I'm going to do now is to go over several research projects that have implemented solutions and how they implemented the solutions. So returning to the Bunkyo University and this curriculum renewal cycle. So you can read there yourself of the steps that they took, okay? I probably outlined all of the steps in terms of the first stage of the curriculum renewal. The second stage is very much simplified, okay? But you can probably see, we saw that can all readily be involved with the benefits or can already see the benefits of the CEFR-based approach. The answer was no, okay? It was diverse, but for some it was no, okay? So I actually did the teacher education workshop, the beginning and training. And after that point, we had people who could not see the benefits actually say, okay, it made a bit of sense. Fergus's English and the way he speaks and he speaks a bit too fast, but I could get most of it. But then after that meeting, they went and said, listen, we know we got to rewrite the curriculum goals based on the CEFR descriptors, okay? I think they're mostly focusing on A1 and A2. And then they modified the can-do statements to serve as reference for the teachers. Then they got in a colleague now, Yuki Naganuma, to provide expert feedback on the lesson can-dos, and probably what he said, well, listen, these are great, but in terms of your learning materials you have right now, there needs to be a bit more what he called spiraling. So if they're doing 5 main tasks in the in one semester, for example, all of those tasks, the task cycle should be relatively similar, so that they're doing, when they're talking about their interests and then they're talking about their family, the structure is basically very similar, so that it's the second and third time of doing the presentation, for example, at the end of the task cycle, is a lot easier. And then they went on to map existing curricula, rewrote the can-do descriptors, then they created the learning activities anew. And then, as is typical in action research, when you finish one cycle, you think, great, we've done it. And then about a week later, I said, do you know what, we could do a lot more. So it's a long and endless cycle, but it's a virtuous cycle. So then they went on and said, listen, okay, there's all of what we created is good, but there's still a bit there that we need to work on. And we need to create new units, looking at the wastage and threshold that we talked about, and discard some that are not aligned, and add a bit more of the spiraling that I talked about there. So, so this, in my opinion, I'm going to present several action research informed Common European Frame CFR informed projects. This, I think, is the best in terms of the scale and how they actually work together. The teamwork of working together. You have 10 teachers working together across 30 classes. And the students coming out of that, what they're doing is very much aligned with what they need to be doing, and it's very coherent, and it's transparent. All of those keywords. If you look back at the aligning language education with the CEFR handbook, all of the points that you're trying to look at: familiarization, specification, standardization, standard setting, validating. They're all there. I can't go into detail right now, but a lot of those steps are there. So that's just to give you one point, one example there. That's the reference there. You see it later. To give you a few more resources. As mentioned, I edit the CEFR journal, so we're lucky to get a lot of bottom-up approaches in recent years. So because I know these well, I'm going to try and introduce these now and to show you these weren't explicitly coming from we're going to do action research, but there most definitely is an action research perspective available in all of these. So the first one was a medical English student conference, what was originally a presentation for medical English students. Right before the pandemic, they were very happy with the process, but then the COVID-19 pandemic hit. They had to flip to a hybrid conference of asynchronous presentations. And to give you an example of all of the steps that they need to do, but basically, this was particularly at the time in mediation, when people were struggling with mediation, and they kind of put mediation at the center of the realigned hybrid conferences to activate all modes of communication. So you have interaction, you have all of those points there. Just maybe to give you, when you talk about all modes of, here, where is it? what it is. So we try to activate all of these modes of communication. The lab, obviously, is the presentation, so there's production. Reception is the interaction in the groups, trying to get the presentations together. And there's reception, and the mediation is mediating the actual medical concept that they're trying to present about. So that was one result that I don't think they anticipated, but that's what it became. And their starting point was, how can we make this hybrid conference a authentic communication task? Okay, that enhances their engagement and autonomy. I don't have time to go into detail. Have a read of it yourself there, but probably all of those processes tells you how they actually go through it. Yeah. So those are just a lot of common European framework informed issues. I'm going to have to skip through these. I don't know if I would have a lot of time to talk about all of them, but maybe that's from bottom up approach there in terms of classroom teachers, how implementing medical English student presentations stroke conferences. Here, the latest edition would have a localized version of the CEFR based curriculum in Israel. And this, obviously, it's a curriculum that's been implemented from the top down, but they've pretty much used the ripple metaphor to see how lead teachers, teacher mentors, teacher educators could ripple the curriculum out, disseminate the curriculum out to teachers in the field, and looking at pre-service and in-service content provision. And the 1 or 2 years that they tried to do it, it did work well. They weren't fully happy with it. They're not fully happy with it. So they're looking at a third stage of implementation where there's more the expert teachers and the teachers work so that the work that they have done beginning to raise awareness of the curriculum, they actually integrates into specific learning practices that take in place in the classroom. So you can probably see here how the bottom up is being brought up and how those teachers are getting a bit of education and getting a bit of information, and then they're saying, well, how are you going to do this? And that's the start of your action research cycle, which I'll get onto in a little bit of time. So I'm not going to, because that looks great, but I'm not going to explain it in detail. But do have a look at, read and see how they actually implement this, how they look at personal logs and how they develop the learning community to work with, to implement and to ripple out this curriculum. Probably, if we look at the second point here, the second publication, this started out as how can we use some of the illustrative scales in the CEFR to apply to the Czech sign language, which has, I believe, has very little recognition and very little work done. But this ended up as being consultants, validators, disseminators, people who were holding the meetings were the Czech sign language community. And they, at the end results of the funded project was a framework for reference for the sign language and a reference level descriptors for the sign language specific to that. Bilingual, both in Czech written language and in Czech sign language. So you can probably see, well, how this has started off as how can we bring in the CEFR and apply it to the Czech sign language education and use. And this is what it ended up to be. And most probably, as I mentioned there, the second or maybe third iteration of this action research cycle is how can we improve the reference level descriptors, or how can we apply them? So we're getting now into how can we apply action research to CEFR informed projects. So this is the model that I'm going to introduce to you. This is the model here. Basically, is they took what they found is the best parts of action research models. So if we look at Mills and Chemist and McTaggart, and there's several other action research models, but they took the best of what from those action research models, and then they put it and see how it could be fit onto CEFR informed learning practices. Yeah. So there's 3 stages, and probably the major defining part of all of these stages is the reflective element. Whereas you would have in a lot of the previous models where you would have plan, do, reflect, whereas this would split it into reflection at the end of each of the stage. So stage 1 being developing a research plan. So you will recognize number 5 and number 6 there. Okay. I've already talked about identifying specific problems and issues and how to go about it. And then proposing solutions, you're going to have to think about that. So the next step if you've gone to steps 5 and 6, talk briefly about it, is thinking, okay, propose a research design. Okay. So if, for example, I know I want to constructively align Chinese proficiency tests, what am I research design? How am I going to begin with the first level? What am I going to do? Then you have your research design, you reflect on it, then you're ready to go on to the next stage, which would be actually implementing the proposed solutions. And then you have your critical review, analysis of research. If you look at number 3 here, sharing and communicating the results, anybody who is doing CEFR informed action research, please submit it to the CEFR journal, because we want to hear about it, and it's a good way to disseminate to the CEFR community. But this is quite a detailed and I would say arduous process, but if you have the resources, go and do it. And there's a lot of people in the room and watching that have the resources. The resources I mean by people is connecting with people and thinking, how can I get to help my teachers to become more acquainted with the CEFR and the particular parts of the CEFR that need to be applied in my context, for example. And then working through as a team. If I'm going back to the Bunkyo example that I first cited, to go through as a team of 10 and understand the CEFR and work through and see what we need to do to constructively align our curriculum. And then you're coming at the end of stage 1 here is you decided on a research design. Then you go ahead and implement it. You collect data to critically examine the solutions. And eventually you're getting to sharing and communicating results. And more than likely, you're going to get to the final sentence where it may lead to a new cycle of action research. I hope it does, because there is no way you're going to implement a perfect solution. Most likely, you're going to think, yeah, it's great what we've done, but we probably need to work at it again. And there's more things that we can do. The presentation in terms of the medical students, probably there is a bit more mediation. We probably need to integrate that a bit more into the group work, for example. Let them reflect and self-assess more in terms of the mediation skills and working together as a team, for example, or mediating the concepts, difficult concepts. So have a look at that 2021 article in the CEFR journal that introduces the model, if it interests you. And part of that funded projects, you have at least 7 projects there that deal with those elements that are on the screen. And they are working through together people who have various levels of knowledge of the CEFR and the CEFR related issues to implement solutions in their own context. and to implement the model in varying degrees. So those are the points. Probably what you should be going now, probably if you're watching online, is probably go back and go, you've done step 6 and step 6 and step 7. Stop now and jot down how you can still, probably done a look to 5 and 6, going towards to number 7, decide on a research design, brainstorm a research design. And then what I'd recommend is go back to number 1 and write it out formally and put a good structure around it. And then you're going on to stage 2 and hopefully stage 3. And probably to begin is to think, is this model appropriate, possible, viable? How much of it is viable? And then who to get involved, and when and who, because no man in an island, and we probably need to work together as a team, as a team that has connections to wider people in the community to give advice. And then we talked about here the invitation to CEFR users to share projects that be included in future iterations. By implementing such an AR cycle, you can put yourself center at the future iteration of aligning education to CEFR. So that's what I have today to say. So thank you for listening.
Thank you. Okay, thank you very much, Fergus, for a really interesting presentation. I can see we've had quite a few questions come through online. One of the questions that's come through is really asking about to what extent learners themselves, to what extent do you think input from learners is important in that process of creating those learner checklists? So to what extent should learners be involved in that process of looking at the CEFR, looking at what they're learning?
As much as possible, they're at the center of the learning. And when you're looking at identifying specific issues, for example, the curriculum, ideally you would have formal or informal focus groups with the learners to actually say, well, what's working well for you? What does not work well for you? And that should inform the issues that you're trying to work on. And there are models of action research that are very much participatory in terms of the learners. So reference them. And yeah, the best action research is has the user center of the action research processes. Yeah.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much. And I'm sorry, I'm not. I'm reading these off, but I'm not being very good about reporting who's asking these questions. So my apologies both to the audience online and to you, Fergus, for that. Another question here. When the CEFR is presented in non-European contexts, is that done as though it were an educational ethos or a set of practices that can be applied to curriculum design? Is it possible to simplify it and make it universally relevant in that way?
It was designed to be universally relevant, and I feel it is. So I don't think it is. And you have practices, probably, I know the Japan context, whereas they probably saw that, okay, they looked at, okay, at that time when the CEFR Japan was beginning, it was A1, A2, A3, but then they actually, well, particularly the students in Japan, they struggled to develop and to see development quickly, and that had very big impacts on learner confidence and learner autonomy. So then they broke that down to A1.1, A1.2, A1.3, which you see in the new processes in the companion volume and other places. So yeah, I don't see an issue with being universal. It'd only be ideology expressing that you can't, but
Okay,
finding difficulties where there's not difficulties.
thank you. Excellent. Just a couple more. One very quick question, and maybe we can put this in the chat later, is I know you referred to a self-assessment website in one of your slides. So maybe somebody on the line has asked if we can put the link to that into the chat. So we'll do that in the break. One final question for you. I notice when on your slides you've given there's a very quite a long list of steps to go through, and obviously that involves a significant amount of resources to do that. If you don't have that a multiplicity of time, of resources, or of things to do that, are there any kind of shortcuts? Are there any parts of that you would say, well, focus on this? So are there any alternative solutions to going through all of these steps?
There are, and well, I think if you are an individual, for example, keep the issue that you identify in number 5 to be very manageable. Don't try and reform a whole curriculum by yourself. Focus on one element of that curriculum, one element that is critical to the delivery of the curriculum and the success of the curriculum, and focus on that and improve it. And then you can work through by yourself or within your limited team to work through all these steps. It is possible, I would say. Yeah. Okay,
that's excellent. Thank you very much indeed. I think we'll have to. Okay. Sorry, one more question. Let me come over.
Fergus, thank you very much indeed for presenting this. I'm interested in your view on whether you think that the use of the CEFR has been taken up more in terms of alignment by people working with assessment than it has with curricular materials and so on. And the reason I ask this is because one reason for the development of the alignment handbook, which I was also involved in, was very much to try and disseminate a wider understanding and take up of a CEFR informed approach. And I'm really encouraged to see how many projects you've been able to identify through the CEFR journal publications, because it's more than I had been led to believe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the CEFR 2001 title was Teaching, Learning and Assessment. So, and we know the triangle, say Barry O'Sullivan's triangle, but try and gets all of them. Assessment most definitely has been forefront in a lot of CEFR related issues, but I think particularly like the European language portfolio was very much a teaching and learning implement, wasn't most successful on a wide scale, but I would probably see, you will see, if you did compare general language teaching 20 years ago, the fundamentals of the learner autonomy, learner involvement, self-assessment, peer assessment, they have become a lot more widespread. And so it may not be publication-wise, has not been foregrounded. It has in the CEFR journal, I would argue, but on a general scale, it hasn't been. Assessment is very much to the front. But I would say the developments in the teaching and learning, there has been a, if you want to use the word osmosis, there has been a big element of osmosis, and that what spreading of the ethos of CEFR to general learning practices.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Okay, well.